Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Osama Siddique. I'm an occasional writer, occasional legal scholar. I'm delighted to have here today with me Kaya Genc, our friend from Turkey, who's a prominent commentator on contemporary Turkish politics, but also steeped in Turkish history and making connections with the literary traditions, the historical traditions, and of course the very complex politics. At the same time, he's also a novelist. Another novel is in the offing. One has already been published in Turkish. He's also written previous books on topics similar as well as different. One volume, which is quite interesting, is actually a critical assessment of the Orientalist travelers who came to Istanbul over the centuries and their accounts of the place. All these books, I've seen them outside, so by all means do get your copies. But the one which we are going to focus on today is called The Lion and the Nightingale. And it's an incredibly intriguing title. And I had the opportunity, obviously, to read the book, and I tremendously enjoyed it and gained from it. But before I give anything away, the metaphor of the lion and the nightingale, and you will notice that there are very interesting correlations with some of our collective experiences. Would you care to say a little bit about why the lion and the nightingale? What does that mean?
So first, thank you for coming to this talk. I'm delighted to be here. And I've been traveling the world in 2017, and everyone was asking me about Turkey, what's going on in Turkey? How are Turks doing? What's happening in your country? And my honest answer was, what do I know about what Turks are doing? You know, I'm traveling the world. I'm reading the New York Review of Books, I'm reading a new novel, I'm seeing the films. How can I just comment on how Turks are living at this moment? So it came from this curiosity to learn about how Turks were spending their days. And I noticed that people around me, some of them were like nightingales, who were fragile, who had beautiful voices, who were producing beautiful things, but very fragile things, and who felt increasingly precarious and unsettled because of the political situation. And then I found another group of people who were very, very different lives, which I call the lions, the people who were wielding power and who were enjoying the power fight in the country. So I thought it would be a good way to look at the country and to see its dichotomies and how those dichotomies are actually problematic. And so this is how I started, asking people how they spend their days, and so that I could be in their shoes. I could tell the story of a cleaning lady as authentically as possible. You know, not my idea of a cleaning lady, but what a cleaning lady tells me about her life, her economic survival. So one book that inspired me was Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers. Mm-hmm. This incredibly meticulous, detailed chronicle of life in India. And so I tried to get as much detail as I could from the people that I talked to, and increasingly I saw that they had very different priorities in life. Mm-hmm. You know, if I talked to a journalist in prison whose main priority was to get out and to hug his wife, and he was finding prison a good opportunity to read Orhan Pamuk's latest novel. You know, he made good use of his time there. But that was his priority. And then I talked to Erdogan's right-hand politician, and her priority was to install the presidential system and to survive the coup attempt and to stay alive. And I then had some long conversations with a barber, and I was always fascinated by Turkish barbers because from Ottoman times they have this very interesting history. How do they spend their lives? So I tried to give as varied a picture as possible in the book. So I divided the year into characters. So we have 12 characters, 11 of which are in Turkey in different cities, and we see life from their perspectives. And the 12th character is a curator who is so overwhelmed by the political situation that she escapes to Hong Kong, thinking that it will be a peaceful atmosphere there. And then she finds that, these troubles pop up everywhere. And I'm the 13th character, coming to different literary festivals, going to residencies, and living my own life. But what I wanted to do was not to speak for people, but to represent them as realistically as possible through long conversations with them. So with artists, it's easier because they're very articulate, and with politicians too. But their articulation, of course, serves some political end. So you have to get rid of the bullshit and take what is real. And then with working people, I found that they were so willing to tell their stories. They would spend another few weeks with me, just telling the minutiae of their lives. But then sending me a text message and saying, "Oh, can you take this out? Maybe my wife will be angry about this." And so navigating all these different lives. And so the challenge was, how can I write the story in such a way that those lions and nightingales continue to be my allies? Because I want to get an update from them. So what happened to you? The barber who was imagining to open his own shop. What are you doing now? And what happened to this politician who was trying to win Erdogan another term? So that's the challenge, this kind of confidential friendship with the interviewees, and to present a picture as realistic as possible.
Okay, well, the book can be looked at in so many ways, but what struck me, one of the various things which struck me is that you find a lot of contemporary assessments of politics. And it's a bit difficult because situations are dynamic.
Yes.
And they're unraveling even as you speak. And there are things which are unknowable and things which you're speculating about, and others. You don't have the wealth of secondary literature which you have when you are sort of looking at the historical. But what you've done here, which I found very striking, was that it's almost anthropological. You're doing these, you're following the life. Not anthropological in the conventional sense, because these are just a few days of their lives which you are capturing. But it's like you said, 12 lives. And you're looking at the larger milieu of Turkish politics also through the lens of these 12 lives, what's happening to them. But I want to both historicize and maybe problematize the metaphors that you've used, right? So because there's more to that, which I think is worth getting out. So the lion of today is not the lion of yesteryears, in the sense that you're using lion as a symbol or as a term for people in power, the power brokers, the ones who actually engage in power politics, or who are, perhaps, to look at it differently, more taken with the entire idea of the formation of the state and what it should look like, rather than those who are talking about liberties and individual freedom. So that's one dichotomy. But you also say something very interesting, if you look at the historical side of it, about the lions of yore. I mean, these were lions who were also nightingales. So I thought, it's interesting because we may have some parallels here.
Yes.
And I'll come to that, but I want you to elaborate a bit on what you meant by that.
Yes, so we have a court culture in the Ottoman Empire where you see lots of sultans writing poetry, these incredibly rich love poems. And also other poets writing love poems for the sultan, because the sultan represents the beloved. And, he's this figure walking in the garden as this incredibly charming figure. And so we don't have that anymore. When you look at the power figures...
No love poems for Erdogan?
No. I mean, he's a great reciter of speeches and poems, but we have lost that kind of connection. And I think losing that connection, the kind of court culture losing that came with the price of mistreating artists. I think the Turkish state forgot how valuable these people are, because it doesn't first have a court culture, and secondly, it doesn't have the institutions to support the cultural world. We don't have literary festivals in Istanbul, we don't have residencies or the kind of institutional support that allow writers to flourish or the artists to flourish. So I think and I was also writing a history of Turkish literature while I was working on this book. And I started that book with the Turkish president. When Orhan Pamuk won the Nobel Prize, the Turkish president was a secularist president, and he didn't call Pamuk to congratulate him. He made a point of not calling him. And I always remember that, you know, even if you win the Nobel Prize, you don't get the call from the president, because it is something that is not a priority for the state. And so that loss of contact between the state, between the lions and the nightingales is, I think it's very costly. It comes with a big price. And it makes authoritarians' job much easier to create polarization and to represent the artistic figures as these marginals who have nothing to do with the life of the nation. Yeah. And also for the artists to hate the political figures, you know, and not understand them, because that was also one of the challenges, to understand the governing party, to understand the conservatives. What makes them tick? You know, why are they doing what they're doing? Is it just power, or what? How does ideology get into this? So this attempt to understand also the political part of Turkey, I think, is lost because of this disconnect.
That's very interesting, because closer to home, one of our experiences has been that Urdu, which is the main language of literature, but of course there's a lot of literature in our regional languages, was a court language at one time. Persian preceded it. It's been the language of high literature, but it's also been the language of common expression. But I think one of the things which happened very interestingly is that also became a language of defiance and a language of dissent. So you've had great poets like Jalib and Faiz and others who wrote, and Faiz especially, who wrote very conventional in some ways romantic poetry using a new diction. But he's as much known for his poetry of dissent, so much so that, interestingly enough, in the agitations which are going on in India right now, a lot of the poetry of dissent which is being used is by Pakistani poets, which is very ironical. Yeah. But in many ways it is also very refreshing, because it tells you that when it comes to speaking up against tyranny, there's a common language and a common cause. So when I read your book, I noticed that when you talk about traditional nightingales, and even some who are sort of contemporary, they are talking about utopias, they're talking about idealism, they're talking about their own pain. But there also seems to be an element of convergence with activism, with fighting back. Now that has problematic outcomes potentially, because it can also politicize the pristine artistic, if there is such a thing. But do you feel that the nightingales are also important when it comes to fighting for civil liberties in Turkey?
Yes, so we have these great court cases in Turkey of the civil society figures these past 2 years. There was an uprising in Istanbul called the Gezi uprising in 2013. And one of the graffiti that was used in the uprising was the bad times began in 1453, a reference to the year Turks conquered Istanbul. Okay. So Erdogan very cleverly used that graffiti, and he said, you know, those are the protesters. They hate Turkishness, and they are self-orientalizing themselves. And, you know, they just want to be friends with the Occupy Wall Street movement, but they've got nothing to do with Turkey. And so there was this, I think, the way that the protesters were represented in the press was very problematic. And they were represented as in cahoots with the Western capitals, and that led to court cases, which are still going on in Turkey, and which have, I think, turned the cultural world of Istanbul, especially, into enemies of the state, which I find troubling, because you can be critical of the state, but when you are an enemy of the state, when you hate the state too much, and when maybe you become a hater of Turkish culture in its entirety, that's another trouble. Because for my generation, for example, Orhan Pamuk was a very important figure, because he, as a Western educated writer, had the confidence to write about Ottoman culture, about Istanbul, all the traditional conservative beauties of the city in an interesting way. But the new generation has this kind of contempt for those who wield power now. And I think the outcome of that will be a hate for history, a hate for foundations, and then leaving those areas to the right wing. So we have shows like Ertuğrul or the Magnificent Century. Magnificent Century is not right wing, but Ertuğrul is seen as right wing. Yeah. So you leave that, I think, very important space in history to nationalists, and you steer away from it, and you only look at the culture of activism. So I've been observing the civil society in Turkey, the activists and all these NGOs, all these civil society leaders, but I'm not one of them. And I have great respect and sympathy for what they're doing. And so I thought it was giving me a kind of advantageous position to observe what they've been doing in all its pros and cons. Because I think there's, for example, this character who lives in Hong Kong. She cannot enjoy Hong Kong because she's always on her phone checking what's going on in Turkey. She's become a political junkie. And I think that's a problem. It's now happening in the US after Trump. The cultural world is complaining, that I'm reading about Trump, 12 hours a day. I want to read something else, but I can't because it feels so imminent and important. And I think that takes away the creative power that the artistic community has, and it's a danger.
I can see that. I guess, as an aside, one thing on which there is perhaps universal consensus is that Trump is not a Nightingale. But it's interesting. Now, going back to history, I'm thinking of the first and the third. Is it the third or the fourth? The first and the fourth Mughal emperors, who both wrote these memoirs in Turkish, and are a very good example. In some ways, one doesn't want to romanticize the past too much, but there's something to be said by the ability of people in power to be able to look at things differently as well. Now, I want to further problematize. I think it's an interesting lens, the Lion and the Nightingale, but there are whole hosts of people in the middle. And one could sort of critique or argue that, are you sort of losing sight of the contours and nuances of the larger polity? What do they want? So there are ideological aspirations, there are notions of the state, but there are also people who are incredibly happy with development, whatever that means. In what sense, so I said something to you when we were having an informal conversation. As an outsider, one of the things which really strikes me is that our notion, and which is a universal notion in some ways of Turkey, is that it has a much more sophisticated political system than we have, because the deep state has been pushed back, so. Deep state in the sense of the military and all that. But at the same time, and we also know that there are several very sophisticated Turkish universities and things like that. But when one hears about the clampdown on journalists, it seems to be more or less medieval.
Yes.
And it seems contradictory. Do you find that paradoxical, or is it just paradoxical to the foreign gaze?
Well, I start with the first question about the people in the middle. My father, for me, represents the man in the middle, and his heroes are Tom Cruise, some Hollywood figures. He loves America, he loves Hollywood culture, and he thinks that at the end of every Hollywood film, the justice is served. But he doesn't like European films because they can end ambiguously. And he was telling me about how a strong police force and a strong presidency means westernized world for Turkey. So the meaning of the West in Turkey has changed from European values to American values over the past decade. And the president's advisor gave a speech about this. He said, for us, the US is the West now, not for Atatürk it was Europe, because he got all the laws and the culture from France and Germany. And Germany was very influential in modern Turkey's modernization, but now it's America. So a very powerful presidency. And so that's a package that Erdogan can sell to people. You know, we need a strong police force. We need capitalism, and we need religious beliefs. So whenever there's a controversial law, you get from the pro-government press some examples from Texas or from some mid-American city, some abortion debate, something like that. So all the discussion is now linked to the American politics. And I think it made it very easy to sell the presidential system 2 years ago. There was a referendum asking Turks whether to implement the presidential system or stay with the parliamentary system that Atatürk liked. So it's an age of strong men, and you know, I remember lots of my father always bringing me to these Hollywood films with these very strong, powerful male characters doing whatever they liked, unilaterally, not thinking of the consequences. And I think that American brand of uncontrolled power has transformed Turkey.
Get the job done.
Yes, and he says, I'm getting the job done. You know, he put a tunnel beneath the Bosphorus, connecting Europe to Asia, you know, and the transportation system, all the new airport, the world's biggest airport. So I always get commissions to write about these things. And always my first reaction is to be very critical about them. But then you see all these people working in those investments. And then you cannot just say no to them, because you try to understand the environmental outcomes, which is terrible. And I always end up putting these a bit romanticized paragraphs about those things. And of course, the way those projects are implemented are very authoritarian. And so I get angry, and I put a few paragraphs about that. But then you also have to put a few paragraphs about people who would otherwise be out of work if not for these projects. And so in Turkey now we have a very interesting situation. The mayor of Istanbul has changed. Now he's from an opposition party. And the central government is, of course, Erdogan. And when you enter a subway, there are all these screens meant to advertise the nice things about the Istanbul city. And now you see very critical videos about the dangers of modernization. And the mayor appears and he says, you know, we should cancel all the projects. And so the opposition now has access to all these screens built by the central government to disseminate its message. But now that the opposition has it, they can send the opposite message, the anti-modernization message. And of course, another interesting thing is the government, which is supposed to be conservative, is very forcefully modernizing. And the opposition, which we call the modernist opposition, is now conservative because they're trying to conserve these areas in the city.
Interesting.
And my hope is that it will also change the Turkish left, because Turkish left has always been very modernizing. You know, the liberty leading her children, the Delacroix, the kind of the fetishization of the French Revolution. But I always wanted the Turkish left to be more like the British left, you know, conserving nature. Yes, kind of John Ruskin, or that kind of let's protect this environment. And I hope there will be a change in this direction.
So, the paradox, which I spoke about in terms of civil liberties, you have a sophisticated discourse when it comes to, in some ways, modernity and development and technology. Sorry. So, in some ways, technology, modernity, all the sort of bells and whistles of not necessarily a full democracy, but still a system which is far better than lots others in terms of maybe per capita income and things like that. And yet this very sort of graphic kind of violence which is meted out to those who are dissenting. Is that a sustainable paradox? Is that something which will be viable? One would have thought it would not be viable, it would be done a bit more discreetly. Considering that the Turkish intelligentsia is quite large and it's quite sophisticated and quite vocal, do you think the politicians or the lions will mend their ways anytime soon?
Well, these court cases are political theater, and it also keeps away real problems of the country away from the gaze of the public. And, you know, the Turkish way of dealing with the dissidents is first going after them, opening court cases, you know, making a professor not able to attend her classes because there's a court case there, and then imprisonment.
Yeah.
And then release, and then re-imprisonment. So it's like, it's a continuing thing. And so that's what we've seen last week when the Osman Kavala, this Turkish society leader, was released in the morning and re-arrested 6 hours later.
Really?
And so it makes it very excruciating drama. So you cannot keep your eyes away from the drama of these court cases. And I think the Turkish state, with all these democratic mechanisms that you described, which are still in place, I think is having a good time. You know, I think those court cases is helping the Turkish state to hide its institutional weaknesses. And as we support and get upset by the results of these court cases, we don't see the bigger picture anymore. So lots of people, I find, are not totally aware of the presidential system and its implications. You know, how could it happen? How could a country which was ruled by the parliamentary system for 9 decades really turn into this American system? And I think Erdogan is very good at managing the public perceptions in that. And I think it's very sustainable because there's a fascination for the public with those cases. And the public's reaction is, let's watch this, you know, it's spectacle.
The spectacle.
And on social media, it makes great lunch hour viewing. Let's see how this person reacts to his freedom and then re-imprisonment. So I think that people actually enjoy this. I mean, I cannot scientifically prove this, but from what I see in very middle-class houses, people are watching this with great interest. And it has taken over their lives, these court cases and what's going on with the intellectuals and Erdogan's fight with them. It's like this great epic. It's almost like an Ottoman epic between these powerful figures. And people enjoy that. Maybe the Swedish system wouldn't work in Turkey. I mean, the kind of stable, boring democracy, because people want some kind of fight in the public sphere. And I think the government's almost total control of the state became a bit boring, and Turkish people wanted to see some action, and they voted for the opposition because now it makes great TV.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in Turkey we have Fox and CNN, and the CNN is supporting the government, and Fox is supporting the left-wing opposition.
Interesting.
And now their ratings up, and the TV presenters are happy, and the journals are flourishing. So I think Turks enjoy watching that kind of fight.
That's interesting, which is true for a lot of places in the world. The spectacle takes over, the real issues go back. Of course, people who are providing the spectacle have to pay the price.
Yes.
If you could talk a little bit about Turkey and Pakistan, because I think there's a personal perception a lot of us have. People know more about Turkey than a lot more other places because historical linkages, the Ottoman Empire, the Khilafat movement, the RCD between Iran, Pakistan and Turkey set up. But it occurs to me, and I was thinking about it because I was going to phrase this question differently. It occurs to me that the hard men or the strong men in Pakistan have always gotten along very well with the strong men in Turkey. Mr. Erdogan was here recently. He's been very strong in terms of calling out what's happening in Kashmir. But even historically, Turkey has been a strong ally. Now, at a personal level, I've been to Turkey twice, and both times it was a remarkably enriching experience, but also I felt a certain warmth extended towards me because of where I came from, which is not something which all of us would agree happens very often, unfortunately. And the very first time I went, this is a surreal little story, and the taxi driver dropped me at a place which was not the neighborhood I wanted to go to. And I was a bit insecure, so I happened to be close to Sultan Ahmed Square. And I went over there, and I tried to speak to these three elderly gentlemen who were sunning themselves over there, and they couldn't understand a single word except perhaps Pakistan. And I am not exaggerating, all three of them started singing Jeeve Pakistan. And so I thought I'm safe. Because then they called some of the younger people and they said, here's a guest in Turkish, I didn't understand, find him a good hotel or take him wherever he wants to. And it was amazing, right? But the question which I want to pose is, and it's a collective question, it's not really directed to you, is that considering that in many ways there's been a commonality of a fight against the deep state, a fight for civil liberties, there's hardly any collaboration or any convergence. Is it language? Is it the fact that Turkey looks westward and we look eastward because of the geopolitical issues? I mean, it's fantastic to have you and Orhan Pamuk in Lahore, and I know you've been here before, but this is more of a bond and an exchange than we have with China, which is the other great ally, where only the governments speak, right? Now there are students there and things like that. But it strikes me as quite remarkable that this very strong bond continues, and there's a lot of goodwill amongst the people, without really meeting that much. There's been a lot of tourism which has started since the plays. People actually now go and look at Topkapi and say this came, which is fine, all kinds of people should visit. But is that something which has, because we all need allies, right?
Yes, and I think it's in Erdogan's political DNA, because when he was 15, Erdogan was a member of Erbakan's party. And that party published a manifesto called The National Vision in 1969. And it was a celebration of the non-aligned movement, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a proposal for a different kind of union for Turkey. And let's leave the European community, OECD, and let's move towards these countries. And I think Turkish Islamists grew up with these ideas of this alignment with Pakistan and Bangladesh. But I think it has returned now, as you described. After years of Turkish interest in places like Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, there was great support for Muslim Brotherhood. And this idea that after Morsi came to power, they would look up to the Turkish system as the system to adopt, because they had what you described as the deep state, the same fight between the Islamists and the military. But surprisingly, Morsi and the intellectuals in Egypt said, we don't want to look up to Turkey, we want to build our own democracy. Okay. And I remember BBC coming to Istanbul, interviewing these intellectuals and saying, should Egypt look up to you to see a good working democracy? Yeah. And of course, after Morsi became history and what happened in Egypt, and I think Turkish Islamists lost hope in that part of the world, the Islamic movements in that part of the world. Yes. But Pakistan, as you described, with this fight against the military and this drama of the Islamist leader and all these coups and fights, and also, of course, the history of the earlier part of 20th century, the shared history, and also I think the nuclear ambitions, to develop a nuclear weapon maybe together, that kind of vision for the future. I think that when I learned that there is no more visa for Pakistan, because 2 years ago there was visa, I was telling this to my friend, oh, it's so nice, there's no visa, to my westernized friends in where I live. And they were like, oh, Pakistan. We don't want to go to Pakistan. We want to go to Norway, we want to go to England. What do we do with the Pakistan visa? I'm like, are you stupid? You can see all these places, it's wonderful. So there's this, I think Erdogan and the conservatives have the upper hand in those discussions, because they say, you don't know about history, the Westernized Turks, they don't appreciate the links that we are forging between cultures like Pakistan. And there's this kind of self-orientalism and this kind of inherent racism against Islamic cultures in many parts of Turkish society. And I think the growing ties with Pakistan is built on that. Erdogan is also now friends with Venezuela, for example, the Venezuelan leader. And that doesn't play super well into his base, People are not big supporters of these Marxist leaders in South America. But with Pakistan, we have this shared history. And I think what you described as this fight against the deep state, that is very much in the DNA of Turkish people, and what makes conservatives popular. But now Turkey is also growing these theories about Western intervention, CIA, all these South American states, Venezuela, these coups, these things. These things don't strike a big chord. Okay. But the fight against the deep state does. It does. So just before I left in Turkey, there was these rumors about an upcoming coup in Turkey. Really? So the Rand Corporation published something about the possibility of a coup. And so suddenly all the fears were awakened. Yeah. There can be a coup, and it's something terrifying for Turks. So when we had the coup 4 years ago, I think it brought out the subconscious of people, all these fears, and it was like a test case, a psychological test case for the military. I think the expectation from the military was that Turks would be just perplexed and just freeze and do nothing, with that fear, maybe that they wouldn't leave their homes. But surprisingly, people took to the streets and they defended the status quo, yes. Yeah.
And that image of the civilians pushing back the army has a lot of resonance, right? So that's why I said earlier that in many ways, one looks upon Turkey as being higher on the evolutionary ladder when it comes to relationship with the deep state and pushing it back. But I want to now, before I sort of open the house for questions, I wanted to move away from politics a bit and talk about you as a writer and structure and style, because reading the book, as I was telling you, I was quite taken by the lyricism of it. So you're talking about contemporary politics. You are sort of juxtaposing historical factors which led to the structure of the state. And yet you also follow the lives of these nightingales. And you also bring forth the very distinct character of different Turkish cities, what it means to be in central Anatolia, what it means to be on the coast. And so you get a sense of the vibrancy of society, which I think is both deliberate, but it's also subconscious because you embrace the diversity of a people.
Yeah.
But you are a published novelist. Your novel has come out in Turkish, and you're working on something else. Is it difficult? Because I'm somebody who also sort of dabbles in both nonfiction and fiction, to decide which narrative voice to follow. Where are you getting really sort of dreamy, for want of a better word, and not analytical enough? And I consider it an advantage because it gives a distinct flavor to your prose, and it also humanizes it in some ways. But I can imagine that it must also be at some level perhaps a challenge.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Penelope Fitzgerald and the way she wrote these great novels, and she would just, if she wrote 30,000 words, she would throw half of them away, just to make it succinct and precise. And so in the book, I tried not to write a travel book with all these sugary details about cities, the beautiful streets of Istanbul or these wonderful mountains, but rather than that, have some rhythm to those descriptions. And so the characters are always moving forward, and we see the scenery as they move, and it just appears and then disappears. And so we don't get these very detailed descriptions as maybe in a literary novel we would. So I think that was the challenge. And also to bring those stories together, to make, see the contradictions between stories by interviewing them. So it has to have a rhythm, and the barber should wake up, do these things, and then there should be a nice switch to the story of the imprisoned journalist. And so it's all about narrative rhythm. And I tried not to repeat the most well-known stories about Turkey and Turkey's modernization or Istanbul's history, but give something fresh, know, and you see it and you feel that it's something fresh.
Yeah, it is.
And it's minimalist, it's nicely curated, and it's not heavy and sugary as we have the Turkish lokums and Turkish pastries. And so I think the sentence length was crucial for that. So very short sentences, tuck, 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 and then a very modern way of looking at Turkish lives, and not to romanticize them, and just look at these strange details. So for example, I went to the Hachkar Mountains in Erzincan in eastern Turkey, where the Armenians left many decades ago, and they left huge crosses on every mountain that they left.
Yes.
And when I was writing about those mountains and the Armenian monastery and the eerie silence of the place, I was accompanied by a Turkish film director, Kutlu Ataman, and his tour guide friend. And Kutlu Ataman thinks that Turkey is very safe, and we were safe in those mountains, and there was nothing to worry about. And his friend, the tour guide, was fearing that we were being followed by the military, and they would come, arrest, and kill us. So very different views.
This is also when they're spotting all those citadels or those structures in the mountains.
So when we are
surveillance here.
When we are taking this tour, there are these two angels. One is saying, all is well, you're safe, just look at the view, and the other one is saying, the Turkish military is coming, they're gonna machine gun us. So this kind of narrative element, I think, would makes the story of those mountains, which
That
would
worked very well,
otherwise be very touristic.
And I guess also a much more sort of stark commentary on how the state is watching you.
Yes.
It's more complex than that, right? So what's the level
Yes.
of local collaboration?
Yes.
How do two very different citizens perceive whether this is for their protection or is this a threat? Because there's no monochromatic view of this. I do want to leave some time. I mean, we could go on and on. There's so many other facets to your book. So Kaya is, of course, an astute commentator on Turkish and indeed regional politics, but also someone who very much grounds his work in Turkish history and culture, and obviously also a fiction writer. And so I hope that there are some interesting questions as well about what's going on now or whatever. Yourself, then you, sir, and then you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome.
Hello.
I have a quick question that usually when the army is removed from the political arena, a more left-wing government tends to take place. But Turkey is a very interesting case in which the army has been successfully, I think, sent into the barracks.
Yes.
But what you've now got is a very right-wing, very conservative government. How
Yes.
does that play out?
Yes, we have a very paternalistic government, and so the role that the army was playing is now played by the ruling class in Ankara. So it is the same role, but played by different actors. So the role is there because...
So will the people vote him out next, or are they happy with him?
No, they're happy. He's strong, he's tall, powerful, very healthy, and his message resonates. And that's important. My mother always says, a politician should be tall and energizing. And so the thing is, I think with the military, I mean, Atatürk was part soldier, part politician. So at the beginning of the Turkish state, we have this figure, this patrimonial figure. And of course, he's the father of Turks. He's not the mother of Turks, he's the father. And so there's always this expectancy of someone overlooking us and watching our movements. And I think Erdogan very successfully got rid of the military to get that role for himself.
This gentleman over there.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming here. Hoş geldiniz, I guess. I wanted to ask you about the.
Bring it a bit closer.
I wanted to ask you about the Armenian and the Assyrian Christians in the East Anatolia, and you mentioned that you went to their places and you felt fearful of the army following you. So could you elaborate that? What sort of fear is there? Do you think that you are building a genocide narrative, or what sort of connection is felt between the Christians that were native to that land and between the modern state?
Thank you. I mean, it was the absence of people on these valleys, which was once populated by these monks and this great Christian civilization. That was the airy bit. So there's no conflict. There's nothing. There's just us in an SUV going along. And then we saw this man who looked like a hunter in the middle of the road, and he just walked toward us, and we just slowed down. And he said, what are you looking for here? Are you looking for lunch? I can show you some places to have lunch. But he seemed very suspicious. I mean, he was an intelligence officer, because the system there is that they work with shepherds. The government pays shepherds to be informants. And so they're keeping a close eye on what's going on outside. And this Turkish director I went there with, he was planning organizing cultural tours in those mountains, because there was a peace process between the Turks and the Kurds half a decade ago, and the military presence would disappear and there would be lots of tourists coming there. That was the plan. But because the peace process broke off, these fears came back. So I think, to take a cynical view, there is great capitalist potential in those mountains. Like, you can see that an investor can turn these places into profit-making cultural places. But as it is very uncanny, and you don't know who to trust. And you feel that you're in the middle of nowhere, governed by... You don't know who's governing those places. So that was the beauty of it, but also you could see that something was not right there. But we got into these monasteries, and we saw all these millennia-old buildings, and we noticed a trend. Those treasure hunters, Turkish treasure hunters, go there to these monasteries and they dig, trying to find what they believe are the gold left by Armenians. So there's some belief that in those mountains there will be great treasures. So you see that most of these grounds are dug by the treasure hunters. And so when we were going back to town, people were looking at us suspiciously. And I said, oh, why do they look at us like that? Do they think we are intelligence officers? Because we were in an SUV. We were like a bit like serious looking. They were like, oh no, they think we are treasure hunters digging their monasteries.
Which is worse?
I don't know.
This lady and then that lady at the back.
So I'm curious to know how you is it loud enough? How you handle the question of representation in your work, because a writer's sense of authority is a very tricky thing. Now, you spoke about transmuting the lives of real people into authentic, realist fiction. Mm-hmm. How easy is that? Because as a writer, I would assume that you would first sift their lives through your lens before writing them out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so you have to be ethnically representative. First, that's the first challenge. The ethnic aspect, the gender aspect, the sexual orientation aspect. So you keep all these things in mind. And so you don't want to get a reaction like, so white, or something like that. This book is so white, or so male, and of course that's what we should all do, because we have this authority that you mentioned. You can just make this a book about white Turkish man, or you can just do it a book about Turkish woman. And so you have this immense authority over who to pick, from which class, from which political orientation. And something I notice in my writing, I always, when I'm writing an essay, my sources, I always try to make them women, because they're underrepresented in Turkish writing about Turkey. They're underrepresented. So, and in order to change the balance to a better place, I'm like, I don't talk to men for my pieces, so sorry, professor, whatever. But in the book, I think there are more women than men, and I think that's the crucial decision you make at the beginning, the structure of the book, who to speak, and then are you reappropriating their voices? Are you a bit condescending towards them? I mean, it's very tricky. And so I sent this chapter about the curator who lives in Hong Kong, so that she could see it. And she was like, oh, do I really seem like that to you? She was a bit upset. And these are the interesting parts of writing nonfiction books, because the characters suddenly feel that that's not me, but then for me that's you. And for example, for her, the trouble was she seemed like a character who escaped from Turkey to Hong Kong. Someone who didn't stay to fight. So, but I was telling her, the fact that you moved to Hong Kong is the main point of the chapter. And you did move to Hong Kong, but you kept on fighting from there. And then you notice people are very used to self-representation over social media posts, but when they're represented by another author, that can be troubling for them. And so I changed lots of bits in that chapter to reassure her that she's not seen like that. Because I don't say to her, oh, you are like that, you don't know what you're saying. I say, okay, if that strikes you as a problem, then I should fix it. So I think working with the subjects is a privilege you have when you're writing nonfiction, because with fiction you don't have it. Your fictional characters don't come and say, you know, I'm not like this. But in nonfiction you have this advantage.
Yes. She's the lady. Mike? Oh, here's.
My name is Rubia Jalani. I'm Secretary of English Literacy Society. I conduct sessions in Adbi Batak and other institutes. Now, my question is this, that in the world is divided, religion-wise, the world is divided into two halves. One is those who follow institutional religions, that is Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And the other is those who are communists, socialists, atheists, or idol worshippers. Now you said that for development, Turkey looks at West. If we look at West, West is not secular. They believe in Jesus Christ. Believe in number one. Now, number two is this, that if Turkey is secular, then how they handle the insurgents in the country? Because in every country, in every state, whether it's secular or not, there are fundamentalists also, and also those who come out and protest against secularism. If secularism is only the means of progress, then it is, I don't think that by being secular you are the developed country, or you develop to the road to the stair of development. So how they handle the people who follow religions in Turkey?
So the secular side of Turkey is also sanctified. We talk about secularism as religion, because the Turkish secularism, because Turkey was the seat of the caliphate for centuries, and because it has this great Islamic culture, the shift from that to a French-inspired secularism had some problems with some emotional problems, like people couldn't adapt very easily to secularism, so they sanctified secularism. So secularism became a religion. And there was a great book by Jenny White, The New Turks, a great survey of the secular Turks and how they have their own rituals, their own secular rituals, which resemble a lot religious rituals, and their own sanctified figures. And so in Turkey, the fight is not between proper seculars and the religious. It's between different fundamentalisms, between different belief systems. So secularism is very much a belief system in Turkey. And that's why most of Turkish liberals were very critical about Turkish secularism, because they thought that, for example, unlike British secularism, it was...
It's become a religion.
Yes, with its own martyrs and its own saints. So I don't think we ever had real secularism in Turkey. So when we talk about the seculars and the legacy of secularism, I think we are not properly talking about that. We are talking about something else. We are talking about a replacement of the Sultan and the religion by something forged by the Turkish military, those who founded the Turkish Republic. But maybe in the future we'll see proper seculars in Turkey, because I think Erdogan became, despite all the problems, I think he balanced Atatürk's secularism with his own religiosity. And maybe because we had these two very powerful figures over 1 century, now we can have more calmer secularism in Turkey, or calmer conservatism in Turkey, because they balance themselves out.
I think time is almost up. Kaya, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could give him a big hand.
Thank you.
I hope you have a wonderful rest of your trip and you keep coming back to Lahore. You'll always find friends here. And thank you to all of you for being such a good audience and listening through what were very important insights. The books, I believe, are still available in front of hall number 1, unless they've sold out. So please do check. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.